Thank you so much, Michael, for inviting me for this talk. And yeah, thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to share my research. Yeah, so I'm Noreen. I'm going to be talking about my work on interior limit of crevasse occurrence in Western Greenland. Um, yeah, this talk is motivated by this question: where is the interior limit of crevasse occurrence on the ice sheet? So why do we care about this question? This is important to understand where in thinner ice, where meltwater can locally get to the bed through the crevasses seasonally. For thicker ice, it says where the cryohydrologic warming occurs, which is meltwater freezing within crevasses, and overall the ice dynamics of the different glaciers in the world. All right. So for our question, we're going to focus on these two areas in Greenland, Western Greenland, Packetsock in central Western Greenland, and southwestern Greenland, north of Serbia. Um, all right. So currently there's these two wonderful data sets available for crevasse detection from Max in 2023 for North of Serbia and Tom Chudley in 2025 all over the Greenland ice sheet margins. But both of these data sets are limited by optical imagery, although they're very high resolution. They provide individual crevasse traces on the ice sheet, but they're limited by the elevation. So for Packet Sock, it's about 900 meters, and for North Summer, it's about 1100 meters of elevation. So how do we go beyond that? So for that, I developed this deep learning model named MimiNet, which is based on UNet for detecting crevasses using Sentinel-1 imagery. Currently, this work is on review in Journal of Glaciology. So the way this model works is that it is trained by wintertime Sentinel-1 imagery, which limits any meltwater presence of the water, any meltwater presence on the ice sheet, making crevasse fields way more brighter and easier to detect. And then we also manually digitize these crevasse fields and any remnant meltwater features on the ice sheet. And then we train the model with the images and the labels, where after the training is completed, the model is able to predict a more uh, finer outlines of these two classes that we have. So using that, we find prediction from Packetsock. So over here, we have Sentinel-1 imagery underneath, and then over it is overlaying the predictions from the MimiNet, where the green polygons are showing crevasse fields and the blues are showing any remnant meltwater features. So in this case, we trained two different models, where the lower elevation is trained on a different model, the higher elevations is trained on a different model. So it's basically just the model is just tweaked in different ways to make sure it's able to learn the features. And also, if you notice that the crevasse fields are a lot more different in these two elevations too, as well as the imagery is also changing a lot more distinctively as well. And then here's a prediction for Narsubsermia. Again, here's a Sentinel-1 imagery underneath, and then over it is the detections from the MimiNet, where greens are predictions of crevasse fields and blues are the predictions of remnant meltwater features. And in this case, I think I used three different models, again, three different kinds of models trained, but overall the prediction is just merged together. But again, if you look at both of these images, both of the Sentinel-1 images, it seems that the higher you go, the Sentinel-1 becomes more and more obscure because it's very high elevation, a lot of snowfall. It's just difficult to overall detect a proper distinction between the classes. So maybe it becomes insufficient in this case. So how do we go beyond that? How do we fix that problem? So for that, we go to a different method. So in this case, I'm going to go to multi-class logistic regression method to predict crevasses. So in this case, we go to about these couple of six X predictor variables that we think are the likely variables that can predict the presence of crevasses on a given location. So we have our principal strain rates, ice surface thickness, ice surface elevation, ice surface slope, and surface curvature. So these strain rates are calculated from the multi-year velocity mosaic. So it gives a snapshot of strain rates of the area. And then we get the surface thickness from bed machine, elevation, slope, curvature, all coming from this wonderful tool created by Tom Chudley, PDM tools that uses ArcticDM to calculate all these variables, minimizing any noise, any filters in the ArcticDM strips. And then after we have these variables, now we go back to the MimiNet detections that I just showed you earlier. So we take our green crevasse fields and our blue meltwater features, and then we fit a logistic regression method with x and y's to find the probability of crevasses of given location. And then finally, we get the output of the probability map of whole crevasses in our study areas. And let's see what the results are like. All right. So here is the output for packet sock from the regression. Over here, the blues are indicating 0% of crevasses available, and one is saying there's 100% probability of crevasse fields being present here. And then there's this box that shows the initial deep learning model training for MeMinute. Anything beyond that is the prediction from the logistic regression. And then, yeah, so our limit is saying it's about 1,350 meters of elevation in packet sock. As you can see, most of these crevasse fields are clustered around Jakobshavn or Surmakajalik. And then, yeah, so if we complement with the previous data sets by Tom Chudley, it seems that they align very well with his detections. As you can see, they are aligning very well here, although we're extending his findings way more inland. And then here's a prediction from Narsubsermia. So now, same situation here. The blues are indicating 0% probability of crevasses, and red is indicating 100% probability of crevasses. And this vertical line is showing the limit, the amount of air that was used initially for the deep learning detection. Anything beyond that is the prediction from the logistic regression method. And you can see the limit is saying about 2,300 meter elevation here. And then let's go back to sort of see how we compare with the other data sets. So it seems that we compare very well with both Max and Tom Chudley's paper at about 1,000 meters where they end. And then beyond that is our limit. So this is a lot more higher than we expected for the elevation in Narsubsermia. You might be confused about this very high elevation crevasses. So for that, we decided to go back to validate with some high resolution worldview imagery. So let me focus on this area here. It's about 1950 meter elevation here. On the left, we have the crevasse prediction from the logistic regression, and on the right side, we have a worldview 1 image from July 23rd, 2019. As you can see, there's these very nice little fine crevasse traces that are aligning very well with the prediction over here. And then let me show another area. This is about 2,000 meter elevation over here. On the left side, we have the crevasse prediction from the regression method. And on the right side, we have the worldview 1 image from July 27th, 2016. As you can see, there's these very fine lines that are complementing again very well with the crevasse field over here. And then let me show another area here. It's about 2,100 meter elevation over here. Left side again is showing the crevasse prediction from the regression method. And on the right side, we have this wonderful worldview image from July 27th, 2016. There's these very fine lines of crevasses. It's very hard to see in this image, but yeah, there's these very fine line of images of crevasses here. And yeah, it's a very high elevation, so it's some of the years it seems that crevasse fields are not visible, some of the years there are. So it's probably just likely because of the ice sheet conditions and snowfall or snow bridge that is probably covering the crevasses over there. And then I also wanted to show the individual predicted performances on the probability of the crevasses. So on each of these plots are showing each of the individual predictors, and on the y-axis we have the probability of crevasses. So it seems that for packet sock, it seems that the principal strain rates play a very strong role in terms of predicting crevasses. And on the right side, my bad. And on the for Narsubsermia case, we have again, I'm showing the same situation where it's the individual predictors are showing how much they are complementing the probability of crevasses. It seems that compared to packet sock, surface slope plays a lot more stronger role for Narsubsermia. As you can see, because you probably know, the Narsubsermia is a more mountainous marine to marine glacier. So as higher you go, the slopes become steeper, and then the higher elevation crevasses come up over there. Um, and then let's see. So yeah, going back to the original question of where is the internal limit of crevassing in Western Greenland. For Packetsock, we're saying that it's about 1,350-meter elevation. For Narsosarmia, we're saying about 2,300-meter elevation. Our results complement and extend these previous data sets very well on the interior of the ice sheet using an entirely independent approach. So thinking back to the results, like why is there this massive difference between the elevation limit? So it's likely because of the difference between the ice dynamics of these two areas, where again, Packetsock is a very slow-moving area and Narsopsarmia is a very fast-flowing glacier. And then finally, the presence of crevasses at such a high elevation indicates the potential of local meltwater drainage to the bed seasonally, now or in the future. So yeah, that's about it. I think I went really quickly, but yeah.
That that was really good, Noreen. I
Thank you.
just place it for
Oh,
everyone a Zoom round of
oh,
applause. And
thank you, thank you.
for those of us just joining, we have questions at the end, but please feel free to just add them in the chat. And next we have Donglai, who just give a minute to set him up. And I think you're pretty much almost right on time, Noreen, so I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Awesome. Well,
But
thank you, Michael, for the invitation. Um, Thanks, Naureen, for a great talk. Actually, it's a good segue to what I do. I'll keep talking about probability map, but instead of looking at the surface of ice sheet, I'll look at the base of ice sheet. And so my talk, by the way, my name is Donglai. I'm a third-year PhD student at Georgia Tech. I work with Dr. Winnie Xu, and I'm going to talk about Bayesian framework for mapping ice sheet basal temperature. So it's pretty important to kind of understand the basal temperature of an ice sheet because it tells you a lot about subglacial environment. For instance, if you have a temperature at the base of ice sheet, it can help us partition the sliding and deformation. It can help us constrain the spatial extent of subglacial hydrology and the water. It helps paleoclimatologists to decide where to drill the ice core because that, it is important to make sure that the old ice layer get preserved instead of being melted away. And lastly, for ice sheet modelers and geophysicists, it's important to use that information to constrain geothermal heat flux. Um, but unfortunately, the reality, which is shown here on the right, is kind of grim. It is grim in that the thermally informative observations that we have are pretty sparse. For example, you might get boreholes, but across Antarctica, there may be just a dozen of them that has temperature data from it. Now we have radar echo sounding, which is a great tool. And there's increasing a number of literature on how radar actually contains rich thermal information about ice sheets. Um, and for instance, if the radio wave, as it propagates through the ice sheet, attenuates a lot, the chances are the ice is warm, then it is cold. And sometimes when we look at reflectivity at the base of the ice sheet, if there's water, there's high reflectivity. But it has the same problem as boreholes, meaning the data are sparse. A lot of radar flight lines, airborne radar flight lines are usually 1,000 kilometers, if not hundreds of kilometers apart from the closest one. On the other hand, you might ask, well, what about doing some thermal simulations, right? These simulations give you a continuous map of basal temperature. But the problem is that these simulation forcings are poorly constrained. It's kind of a circular reasoning because we don't actually know what is a good geothermal heat flux at all. And on the other hand, the heat transfer also needs pretty well constrained basal mechanics, which we also don't really know. So there's a lot of unknowns, and I don't want to make it, really discouraging. So I want to start by showing you just about, how much observation, or to be specific, thermally informative observation that we have at a drainage basin. And a drainage basin is Amundsen Sea embayment, which is in West Antarctica. It is one of the most heavily surveyed drainage basin in Antarctica. And over the past decades, a lot of airborne radio echo sounding survey has identified the water and average ice temperature from radar attenuation. Um, and I'm not going to the nitty-gritties of what these data sets are about, but just to kind of give you a mental picture of what they look like. And to kind of summarize what they look like something like this, right? A chessboard of radar flight lines with sporadic points that tell you something. Either it's a binary, like there is frozen base, or it's a thawed base, meaning not a melting point or a melting point, or some pretty nebulous depth average temperature quantity. And our ambition is to use this information to infer a continuous temperature field at a base. Now, to put it into the table and summarize it a little more, we have a pretty dire problem at hand. We have these sparse data, and that the observation constraint is pretty weak. They're informative, but they're not strong. And to better contextualize this problem, I like to kind of bring in a more classical problem, a more classical inverse inference problem in glaciology, which is to infer the basal attraction or sliding law coefficients. Now a staple practice in initializing ice sheet models. And for that kind of problem, we use ice sheet surface geometry, ice thickness, surface elevation, and surface velocity, which are pretty dense and complete. And the observation constraint or the observation uncertainty is pretty low. The constraint is pretty strong. So I think that motivates well that for our problem, which is challenging, we actually have to get a step ahead. We have to think about uncertain quantification from the very beginning because of how deep uncertain these observations are, and it's not a cherry on top. And in addition to that, we need to use thermal simulation ensemble, not just a simulation, but many of them to kind of create a physics prior to address that observation sparsity. And I'll come back to that later on in case the terminology doesn't make sense to you. So as a start, I use a numerical ice sheet model called SSM to create a large thermomechanical model ensemble over 1,100 models. And these 1,100 models kind of thoroughly perturb and to kind of understand all possible combinations of basal temperature and depth average temperature. And so what you see on the top are basal enthalpy, which you can just think of as basal temperature, and 5 random samples from that ensemble. And on the bottoms are depth average attenuation rate. And these are masked the same way as the radar flight line in Amundsen C embayment. And these are converted from depth average temperature using the Rines relationship that is commonly used in radioglaciology. Now the task is to really understand the joint probability of these two variables, right? The depth average attenuation rate and basal enthalpy, and of the entire drainage basin. This is a very high dimensional problem. For example, a single drainage basin map has over 65,000 vertices. You cannot estimate kind of a joint density over 65,000 dimensions. But what you can do is to use some kind of reduced order modeling. In this case, use principal component analysis to massively compress the dimension space of the data sets into some 30 dimensions. And we estimate the joint distribution of these two variables in 30 dimensions using Gaussian mixture model, which is pretty classical kind of a statistical learning way of estimating density and even challenging density distribution by just breaking it down into clusters of Gaussian distributions. And finally, to kind of acquire the basal enthalpy distribution, we need to propagate the observed depth average temperature, observed depth average attenuation rate in this drainage basin. And this plot here shows the kind of uncertainty of basal temperature before and after that propagation of observations. And we see that before it was propagated, the uncertainty isn't very high. These are just uncertainty coming from the simulation ensemble alone. But after we propagate the observation uncertainty, the uncertainty just gets blown up. And this shows that the basal temperature is pretty sensitive to depth average attenuation rate, which is fine, right? We acknowledge that it's not a very strong constraint, but we have to do something to kind of mitigate this. We cannot just say this is our answer, right? So to mitigate that, there are ways that we can incorporate other evidences that I talked about, but I haven't really assimilated them, which are the more definite but scattered sporadic basal thermal state evidences. I'd like to give you an example. If you draw 3 samples from the prior distribution or from from this distribution. And you have an observation at this part of Amundsen Embayment upstream of Thwaites Glacier that shows that there's actually water here, meaning the temperature at the base is probably at melting point. And these three samples should be mapped into some functions that acknowledge that physical constraints, right? If the sample 3 is saying, well, my temperature is at melting point, that's good. The likelihood should be 1. And other samples that says it's not at melting point, they should be penalized. And the same reasoning should apply in the opposite direction, where for this orange dot, if we have evidence that the base is actually frozen or there's no water, we should penalize any samples that predict there's water in there and just say we don't know. Well, we should not penalize anything, but we just, for other samples that are below pressure melting point, we think they are equally good. So these two kind of curves, we use kind of expression to parameterize them. And assuming that each individual evidence of this basal thermal state are independent. And so we can express this likelihood function as essentially a product of all of them. This plot shows essentially all the subglacial lake and high specularity, meaning existence of water from radar, and also places that we are pretty confident there's absolutely no water in this drainage basin. Finally, if you have thought about Bayesian statistics, you have heard me talk about prior and talking about likelihood, this sets up very well to a Bayesian problem. And Bayesian problem is to say, what is the probability of the basal enthalpy, basal temperature, given these evidence? Now, I'm not going to talk about exactly what goes into finding that posterior distribution because that is a separate topic. In fact, it's really where the computational heavy lifting is for this project, but I'm just going to focus on kind of the end result. And in this case, the posterior ensemble. So this plot shows you the kind of 3 snapshots or 3 samples from the posterior distributions. On the left, have 5 percentile samples. On the middle, you have the mean distribution, a mean from the distribution. On the right, you have the 95 percentile. So this kind of encloses the majority of the posterior density masses. And the plots are showing the degree to melting point. So if they're black, that means that the base is thawed. It's already a melting point, and it's kind of highlighted by these white lines. And if it's not, it has color, then they are kind of subtemperate, they are frozen, they're not already at melting point. What this shown is that, well, majority of Thwaites glacier in the fast flowing trunks and in the piling glaciers are thawed. And it's pretty outstanding where upstream of Thwaites glacier leading into the Bentley Trench are all thawed across all the posterior samples. And that there's kind of in around Thwaites eastern shear margin and upstream of Thwaites glacier, there are large areas of near thaw region. We're looking at less than 5 degrees to pressure melting point. These are interesting areas to kind of motivate us to ask for future works that is there a possibility that the glacial changes happening in this drainage basin are going to drive the base to become thawed? So I'd like to conclude that for this work, we developed a Bayesian framework that combines a large numerical ice sheet ensemble and sparse geophysical observations to infer a continuous ice sheet basal temperature. And we applied this method to Amundsen embayment and revealed the near thawing base outside the eastern shear margin and upstream of Thwaites Glacier. Thank you very much.
Amazing talk, Donglai. An amazing round of Zoom applause there too by the audience. And now Josh is here. Yay, Josh. And
Yay.
and now Josh is our last speaker. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And then we have a Q&A for all the speakers at the end. So feel free to take it away, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael, and thanks for the invite. Give me a second to move my Zoom stuff out of the way. Cool. Cool. Yeah, so shifting gears a little bit, I'm going to talk today about supraglacial lakes, specifically in Greenland, and more specifically, how we can go about automating classifying the drainage mechanism of those supraglacial lakes using satellite imagery and machine learning. This is part of a broader project that I'm involved with a bunch of co-authors that you see there, my advisor Yao, Ellie, Michael, a couple other group members, Niall and Ojin, and then Laura Stevens at Oxford and Lee Stearns. Great, let's get into it. So just a little bit of like zoom out motivation, why we care about supraglacial lakes in general. More broadly, we care about supraglacial water, in particular because it doesn't always stay there, right? There are these incredible features and processes by which that water can be routed from the surface of the ice sheet to the bed of the ice sheet. And this is a video I took a couple years ago during some field work in the central west region of Greenland near Jakobshavn. And you can see all these chopped up ice chunks. You can see these fractures. You can see them kind of dispersed across the surface of the ice, several hundreds of meters to kilometers away. And in particular, this feature that we flew by, right, is an active moulin that was sort of spawned in what you can tell is the wake of a supraglacial lake drainage. So what used to sit here, where you're seeing is a massive lake that the stresses in the ice beneath that lake were sufficient such that all of this fracturing that you see here happened, and that water mostly disappeared into the ice, leaving behind a moulin, which is what that river is currently running into. And this is fascinating, right? Just because it's fascinating. But beyond that, there are significant implications for ice dynamics and therefore knock-on effects for, implications for things like sea level rise. One such implication is, right, there's this projected inland migration of the presence of these supraglacial lakes over the coming couple decades, right, with the continued warming of the climate. If that happens, and if those inland lakes can indeed fracture and transport their water directly from the surface to the bed, it could potentially have more destabilizing effects, as the inland subglacial hydrological system is thought to be a little bit more sensitive to these water influxes. Right, and it also has sort of chain reaction implications, right? There's this hydrofracture lake drainage cascade hypothesis, which says that if you move water from the surface to the bed, whether that's through a lake drainage or in this cartoon here, a moulin, right, you sort of reduce the frictional coupling between the ice and the bed, and then that could potentially lead to stress perturbations in the overlying ice that might be sufficient to trigger another lake to drain. More water is then deposited from the surface to the bed, further increasing the load that the membrane stress has to carry, potentially triggering another lake to drain, and so on, in this sort of domino effect. So it's important to try to understand, right, like, where are these events happening and are they triggering each other? And so the first thing that I'm doing here is trying to say, well, where are these hydrofracture events actually happening, right? But more broadly, there are all of these lakes. Like every season, there's on the order of a couple thousand, maybe 5,000 to 6,000, depending on how warm of a year it is, lakes across the entire surface of Greenland, and their drainage behavior is very different. Some of them drain, sort of slowly via an outlet stream. Some of them don't drain at all. You can see here in red, and some of them disappear quickly. So if you keep your eye on the ones in the green boxes here, all of a sudden, between one time step and another, they disappear. But where's the water going, right? Like, which ones of these actually lose their water into the ice versus just across the ice sheet surface? Both are important, and it's the distinction that I'm trying to get at, if we can do that with machine learning and just satellite observations. So we're interested, right, in where, when, and how much water is moving about and into the ice. And we're not starting from nothing, right? There is a lot of literature that has been built up over the years, which classify these lake drainage events. And most of the literature uses sort of a temporal window classification. So you're looking at, the area evolution of the water over time, and if that water disappears, if 80% of that water, for example, disappears in a certain window, 4 days, 6 days, whatever it is, you can label it as a rapidly draining lake. A lot of those rapidly draining lakes are these hydrofracture events, but not all. And then there's some more recent literature that has looked at analyzing the bias that comes from observational, constraints, right? We have clouds, we have no data days. And more recently, a paper that came out last year, right, is the first sort of attempt to use deep learning on a scalar representation of spatiotemporal features. So using satellite imagery, sort of compressing all of the information in time-evolving satellite imagery into scalar features and using that as a detection classification. In this work, we try to build on all of this existing literature where we learn, we use 2D, so an full image representation of these spatiotemporal features to try and classify these lakes. And so we build on this amazing data set that Devin Dunmeyer et al. Published last year in 2025, which has the lake locations for 2 years across the entire ice sheet, 2018 on the left and 2019 on the right. And we're just going to focus on the Central West region. There's a lot of studies that have in situ studies, field work that has been done in that region, and it's also a pretty dynamic area. So we have a lot of good content in that area. In particular, what we see on the left is all of the locations of the lakes that Dunmeyer et al. Have identified in the 2019 season. The area of the circles is proportional to the amount of water that's in each of those lakes. The same points are on the right as we click through the summer season. The only difference is in the label. And so you can see on the left, the labels, the classes are, there's three main classes: refreeze or buried, rapid in green, and slow in orange. And so this is sort of what the Dunmeyer work did, right, is to identify classifications of rapid drainage versus slow drainage. And that's something that you can do really, really well with a scalar representation of the lake evolution. What's tricky to do with just a scalar representation is to break those classes into slightly different categories. Still having a no drainage category on the right now in red, a hydrofracture specific category, a moulin drainage category, a lateral drainage or stream drainage if the water disappears across the surface, and a crevasse field drainage. And so what we're trying to do is say, well, can we use deep learning to learn this 5-class problem? And the answer is kind of so far. It's a tricky problem. So let's just look at what do those classes even look like. And I apologize, there's a lot of flashing colors on this screen. But what you see here are those 5 classes. On the top left, no drainage. Middle top, hydrofracture. And across the bottom row, we have a moulin drainage, a lateral drainage, and a crevasse field drainage. And these are the locations of those lakes in the top right. And then below each of those panels is this sort of scalar representation that I've been talking about, ticking across time steps. And so what we're asking is, can we combine this scalar representation, which is sort of an area curve? You can think about it as the percentage of water in that lake across the season, with the actual imagery in a deep neural network to be able to identify these mechanistic classes: crevasse drainage, no drainage, hydrofracture, lateral, and moulin. Maybe I'll let these kind of loop through again so we can just get a little bit of a look. If you focus on the lateral drainage, you can see that to the bottom left corner, there's an outlet stream that drains the lake over time. If you then look at the hydrofracture lake, let it get to the point where it disappears quickly. it's difficult to tell, but if you zoom around a little bit more in this image, you'd be able to see sort of a hydrofracture feature here into which the water goes, which looks something like what we saw in the video in the beginning. And so to do that, this is just a schematic of the network. It's a multi-stream convolutional based recurrent neural network architecture. So it's built on what's called an LSTM, a long short-term memory, kind of a goofy name. But essentially, it's a neural network that can digest both spatial features, like you see here in our input, right? So a two-dimensional array where you have different channels, red, green, blue, you can have near infrared, you can have masked channels, along with that stacked across time, right? So across the summer from May 1st to September 30th, we have 153 time steps. And what happens is we throw that into a sort of spatial context compressor in this front end CNN, which breaks it down from 512 by 512 by 153 by 4. So this massive tensor, right? It breaks it down into a slightly more compressed version of those features, where we still have 153 time steps, but all of those spatial features are compressed into 64 channels and 32 by 32 two dimensions. That gets thrown into an LSTM, which basically unwraps the time steps and processes each time step one at a time with a couple of memory gates. So I won't get into the details, but it has a way to basically remember from the beginning to the end of those time steps, as opposed to just treating everyone as independent samples. They are correlated. After pulling the output features from the temporal LSTM, we combine those with what we saw before, which is that water area curve or that scalar representation, which implicitly exists right in this imagery. But what we found is if you explicitly give the network this water area curve, because there is a high correlation between rapid and hydrofracture, for example, and slow and lateral, for example, it helps focus the network and it helps sort of take those edge cases, take care of some of those edge cases. And concatenate those features together from the spatial network and just the scalar network into a classification standard multi-layer perceptron, and out pops your classification, right? So the idea is you input imagery and this water area and out pops some classification of those classes: no drainage, hydrofracture, Moulin drainage, lateral drainage, and crevasse drainage. So how does it do? The answer is okay so far. These are results that are still fairly preliminary, but they're promising. What I did here is trained a very baseline model. And so I haven't done an extensive hyperparameter sweep or architecture tuning. But already with the base model, I'm getting some promising results. And so I'll walk you through. On the top left, we have the loss function. In blue is the training curve, which you can see continues to learn and in fact overfit, which is a good sign for now. It means it's learning. The validation curve plateaus and then begins to increase. So again, it is overfitting. On the top right, though, what we can see is that throughout all of those iterations, this is on the validation set. The confusion matrix, where on the vertical axis is the true labels and on the horizontal axis is what our model predicts, is it's getting more confident. So if you see across the diagonal, darker blues with as the epochs tick on, what that means is that our classifier is getting more and more confident in its labels, and more of them are correct. The bottom two plots show the F1 score, which is a sort of harmonic average of precision and recall. So it's sort of how good at handling false positives and false negatives is true positives is the classifier. And it's interesting, it depends on the class. For example, crevasse drainage in purple, it does a really good job. It's above 80% confidence, right? But for Moulin drainage, it really struggles. And that's not that surprising. Moulin drainage is inherently a difficult class to identify, even as a human. Sometimes Moulins are in the lake basin. Sometimes there's a stream that leads to them, and they're very small features. So it's not surprising that the network learns that last, and it struggles to learn it at all. This plot here, we just have that same F1 score on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, we have sort of an ablation study where if we only give the network 200 training examples, so 200 lakes, it performs poorly. If you give it up to 800 lakes, it performs better. And so this is motivation for me to make more labels, for better or for worse. The more data, generally, the better the performance. And that's exactly what this is showing here. And so that's something that I am working on, is making more labels to see how good we can get the performance with a larger data set. And what I want to highlight here is right, the ground truth on the left, the middle is the model prediction, and then the ones that the model gets wrong are bold here on the right. And you can see that in particular, it struggles with Moulin drainage, which we saw. It gets 64% of those wrong, so it's pretty bad. And lateral drainage, it gets 58% of those wrong. But actually, this is somewhat interesting, and I think it speaks to like what my next steps are, which is that it's difficult sometimes to separate Moulin drainage from lateral drainage. Both of them oftentimes have a stream. And so one possible future step is to treat this as a post-processing issue, right? Where you combine Moulin and lateral drainages into one category and you deal with separating those out as a post-processing step instead. And I'm already seeing on preliminary models that does in fact help increase the model performance pretty significantly. So the future is, the ultimate goal is a Greenland ice sheet wide sort of living data set, right? So this automated drainage classification each year. We started in the Central West with these two data sets from 2018 and 2019 from Devin's work. And the immediate goal is to expand to the other regions, and then to expand outwards from just 2018 and 2019 into the past as far as the Sentinel-2 record goes, and then out into the future and beyond. So, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, for an amazing talk, and another round of applause for all the speakers. And now we have the remainder of the time for questions. Oh. If no one has a question right away, I'll go first. For Naureen, I'm super impressed with MimiNet. I'm kind of curious about like if you've tested different velocity products too, and how sensitive your output for crevasse area is to the velocity product you are calculating strains with or strain rates with.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the strain rates, because they're relying on the velocities, they do affect the crevasse predictions a lot more strongly compared to the other predictors that we have. So yeah, it depends on like how are you getting the strain rates, what kind of filters you're using, what kind of functions you're using to get it. So yeah, it's still a little bit of work in progress to get the right way to get them out. Yeah, but for now we have that one snapshot based data set only because velocities are changing and every time, yeah, and I don't think we have, I actually I'm not aware of if there's anything better than the data set that we're currently using for the velocities. Um, the way it's processed, and everything. Yeah, so that's something we're still working on. But yeah, strain rates are definitely very sensitive, so very important.
Thank you. Looks like is it Leah?
Yeah, it's Leah. Hi. Uh,
Leah.
I have a question for Donglai. Super cool to see where your work like went after we talked last year. And I was wondering like how scalable is it? Like what's the computational efficiency if you wanted to transfer it to another site in Antarctica? Like how like time consuming is this training? I think like most of the time probably goes into setting up this prior with this terminal simulations.
Yeah, good question. And yeah, nice to see you again. I think not very scalable, but there's depending on which part you're talking about scaling, and the computational costs most of the time spent on coming up with the thermal ensemble, right? It's running ISSM models, and hoping that they converge, right? And you probably need to run a lot of them. I think 1100 and 1200, something like that is, we don't really know how much is needed, but it's definitely not, 1 or 200. And so that's where most of the time I spend. The Bayesian part itself, or the Gaussian mixture model, is super fast. It's like half a second. The posterior sampling, which I used Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, takes about like half an hour, which is not bad, right? These inference part are actually pretty fast. And well, it depends on your, the posterior landscape and all that. And so the answer is probably depends for the inference, but the real cost is really how you build your model ensemble. Yeah. But with clusters and parallel computing and all that, I think that first computation expense can be massively reduced, or the time that's spent on doing that could be massively reduced if you plan it well. Yeah.
Can you just like, so I can better picture it, can you give me a number? Like, how long did it take to set up the prior data for the Amundsen embayment?
Do you talk about like to run a model, like a run one thermal
Like,
model, or
like
just
the
setting up?
time you needed to get your prior data together.
To get it prior data. Now I know how to do, these kind of like, build these models. I think the time will be like getting, surface velocity, those kind of data, and running inversions, do forward runs in probably a few days.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, a few days. But to, get to where I am right now, it's like 2 years.
Any other questions?
I put some questions in chat.
Oh, yes, we can go ahead and answer. Trevor, I'm assuming that's Trevor. Trevor, do you want to just like say them out loud to the speaker?
Oh, I was going to ask Naureen, what's the deepest crevasse which is known in Greenland? Now, I think there's one 200 meters deep in Antarctica, but I'm not sure about Greenland.
I don't know the exact number, but if there's like a hydrofractured, fully penetrated crevasse all the way to the bed, I think the number could be anywhere near about 500 meters to almost a kilometer thick ice if there's a full penetrated crevasse, but
Yeah,
don't
well,
take
as I
the
said in
higher.
another chat,
Yeah.
I personally doubt that water would fall vertically to the bed. I suspect there are layers in the ice because the ice is moving at different speeds, at different altitudes. And so the water will go down and then along, perhaps horizontally, and then down again, and then horizontally, and get to the coast that way without probably never falling directly vertically to the base.
I can address this one. Yeah, it's an interesting mental picture. And it is what we see in temperate ice. So commonly like in the Himalayas, you get these like karst-like environments, that exactly what you're describing is happening. You have these like steps, and the water does not fall vertically. But in cold ice, like in the Greenland ice sheet and God forbid Antarctica, it does go more or less straight down. It's slanted a bit, but it's much closer to more like a waterfall, more like a vertical waterfall, than like a karst-like environment.
Yes,
Yes, it's
but
really
cold ice probably only goes down 200 meters, and below that it's warm. And it also moves much more flexibly. It's not like a rock anymore, it actually flows and would close up lots of crevasses.
That's right. Yeah, absent water flow to keep the fracture open, it will absolutely close quickly. Yeah, thanks for those insights. That's really good.
So we got a few minutes. Any other questions for the speakers?
I have a
Well,
question
I
for
did have
Noreen?
another one for Donglai in chat.
Oh,
So I asked what percentage of Antarctica is probably cold-based.
Trevor, that's exactly the question that we're trying to answer. I don't think we know. But you had a good point, right? The ice is pretty thick, and knowing, it's very ice is such like thermally insulating material. It should be a lot of interior should be warm based, and we do see a lot of subglacial lakes in the interior, which indicates that kind of effect. But I don't
Yeah,
think
well,
we can.
Antarctica is full of subglacial lakes,
Yeah, right.
so which proves that it's warm-based.
Yes. But I think, it's hard to say right now what exactly the percentage of that is, but that will be the ultimate goal that, this kind of framework can hopefully answer that.
It might be that it's only cold-based, more or less round by the coast, where the ice is thinner.
Yes. Yeah. And it's usually not just thickness, right? Thin ice definitely has that, that definitely contributes to that, but also, ice velocity and surface mass balance, which controls the vertical velocity. And that is actually a very important control on heat transfer. So
Yeah,
to the
okay.
first order, yes, ice thickness is important, but the complexity builds up as you look into the other factors.
Okay, thanks.
Noreen, did you have something to add?
I actually had a question for Josh, but
Yeah, you can do it. Go for it.
anyway, Josh, you have a wonderful network going on. That's very impressive. Um, yeah, you were talking about how you want to increase the training data for your model, which obviously you should. But I was thinking like how would you go about any data augmentation if you want to produce any artificial data? Like how is that even possible in this very complicated data set structure and the model itself?
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, I have played with it fairly conservatively on the data augmentation side. So the only things I've tried have been just like very simple flips and rotations. If you have a time series, flipping all of the, if this is time one and time, end, you flip all of them to make sure that you don't have a lake. But you can't just randomly flip different time steps. I hesitate to do kind of anything because I'm also curious and right, like there are going to be drainages that are spatially dependent, right? So generally, if you have like an outflow stream, it would probably, on average, flow from higher elevation to lower elevation. Now, if you're training in the same area and you've flipped everything and you have then a drainage that seems to go north when the flow is, generally, to the west, east west, I'm not sure if that would matter. What I have seen is that when I do augment the data, you get better results. And so your network performs better. If let's say you 8x your data from, you get up to several thousand, maybe 5,000 training examples, even if, seven or most of those, whatever, 7 times of those, you only have one real set and then it's sort of repeated, you still get increased model performance. And so I think the thing that I'm curious to try now is right, like make more real data. So just label more. And then augment that on top of it. And so you can then start to do like a real ablation where you first ablate through like your augmentation and then down into like your actual training labels. But I am wary also of there's distinct distributions in different regions and also across time. So even 2018 to 2019 within the same Central West region, right? 2018 was a relatively cooler year. 2019 was a relatively warmer year. And the distributions can be up to like 10% different. There's maybe 10% more hydrofractures in 2019 than there were in 2018. And so trying to deal with that carefully is another question across both time and space.
Great answer.
Alan, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, I had one longer question and one quicker question. So I'll go with a really quick one for Josh. I'm curious, you mentioned you were using Sentinel-2 data mostly. Have you explored using other data sets, maybe higher resolution temporally or anything like that, or lower resolution to be able to extend further in time in different directions?
Not with the network. I mean, so originally my intent was let's just pull everything we got and throw it into a network, right? And I got kind of scared off of that, just thinking, well, maybe I should just start a little bit more slowly, right? And see how well does it do with just one data source, and then maybe add another one. And in the next one, right, the most natural one would either be, I don't know, maybe even just Sentinel-1 to fill in those data, the days where you have clouds, and that confounds the model currently. Or maybe it's Landsat where you have less, spatial resolution, but it's still RGB. But that's definitely something I'm curious about, if you can use that to sort of fill in the gaps and then extend further in time as well. But I figured I'd start small.